This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
In 2020, extreme poverty will impact 1 out of every 10 people in the world.
How can we ensure that there is enough water for farm as climate change and population grow?
And as the pandemic spreads, food insecurity could rise.
政府帮老百姓脱贫能扮演什么样的角色？
Poor infrastructure and limited access to clean water.
हमारे जैसे लोगों के लिए आवास को किफायती रखने के लिए क्या किया जा सकता है?
A lack of education and limited technology.
¿Cómo se puede lograr que todo el mundo tenga un acceso a la educación?
And the problem is heightened by climate change and natural disasters.
Why can't the government raise and enforce a decent minimum wage for the workers?
Inequalities like gender discrimination and inadequate access to health care.
¿Cómo pueden buscar trabajo las mujeres si tienen que quedarse en casa cuidando de sus hijos?
What causes poverty around the world?
我们现在已经实现了全面脱贫，那我们下一步应该怎么样做才能巩固这个扶贫成果，让这些脱贫的老百姓不再返贫呢？
Can we find solutions?
Welcome to CGTN's Global Action Initiative. At a time of unprecedented challenges and a global crisis, we're taking a deeper look at ways to tackle poverty. 2020 has been a challenging year as the coronavirus pandemic roils economies around the world. Tens of millions have lost their jobs, their income, their homes, and healthcare. Income inequality is rising as more and more people slip into penury. How can this trend be reversed? What are the solutions? Is technology the answer? Over the next hour, we'll examine ideas to help lift people out of poverty. Among other things, we'll explore an idea that is increasingly gaining ground: universal basic income. China and the United Nations are wrestling with the reality that the pandemic has worsened long-standing conditions, creating new challenges in the fight to eradicate poverty. So what's the way forward? Here's China's ambassador to the UN, Zhang Jun.
China's achievements has given a strong impetus to the 2030 agenda. Great undertakings require great efforts. With the COVID-19 pandemic taking its toll on the global efforts of poverty reduction, China has been conducting targeted programs for poverty alleviation while making strenuous efforts to fight COVID-19. As the world's second largest economy and the largest developing country, China will achieve SDG 1 10 years ahead of schedule, providing strong support to the global cause of poverty reduction and a predictable outlook for the full implementation of the 2030 agenda. Eradicating poverty is the common ideal of humankind and a big challenge for the international community. With different circumstances, countries have their own approaches to reduce poverty. In China's case, we take poverty reduction as a national priority and take relentless efforts on this front. China took the lead in achieving poverty reduction of the MDGs and helped raise the level of global ambition. We emphasize green development in fighting poverty to allow poverty reduction and the environmental protection to reinforce each other. We vigorously developed the digital economy to enable vulnerable groups to fully enjoy the dividends of development and lead a better life. All these practices can be useful and helpful reference for other countries. To deliver prosperity for all, China advocates a community with a shared future and commits to win-win cooperation. 34 projects that involve several UN agencies and benefit dozens of countries are being implemented through the China UN Peace and Development Fund. For 3 consecutive years, China drafted and pushed for the adoption of a UN General Assembly resolution on rural poverty eradication to channel more development resources to poverty reduction. Zero poverty is an eternal pursuit of humankind. Through hard work, the Chinese people have forged a unique path of poverty reduction with Chinese characteristics. China is committed to contributing its ideas, solutions, and strength to the global cause of poverty reduction. I believe as long as all countries work together, we will surely realize a world without poverty and usher in a better future for humankind.
According to the United Nations, in 2018, almost 8% of the world's workers and their families lived on less than $1.90 a person per day. Many lack food, clean drinking water, and sanitation. I asked the administrator of the UN Development Programme, Akim Steiner, about the fact that poverty levels are rising for the first time in more than 2 decades.
Without any question, this is a major setback. Now, for some, this is a reason to put into question the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that would be a misguided and I think flawed conclusion. Much of what we are dealing with right now, the SDGs in fact try to address, which is the risks that are inherent in the kind of economic development pathways we have chosen, where inequality, lack of sustainability have made us increasingly vulnerable. So the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, are clearly in a retreat mode right now from the point of view of targets and indicators and timelines. But we can also come out of this crisis perhaps by pivoting forward, and that is very much where the Secretary General of the United Nations has repeatedly called on countries to look at how to build forward better.
Millions around the world, including children, have no idea where their next meal will come from. Last year, 135 million people suffered from acute hunger, the highest in many years. That spike was caused mostly by war and armed conflict. The World Food Programme won the Nobel Peace Prize earlier this year for their fight against food insecurity and efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon. Here to tell us more is WFP's Deputy Executive Director, Amir Abdullah.
The food assistance that WFP provides is a lifeline for many people. For us, we found challenges on several fronts. Obviously, we rely very heavily on donor contributions. And we have to say that the people, governments and people of the world were extremely generous, because notwithstanding that they had many economic challenges of their own, our contributions levels continued. However, because of this increase and rise in need, the amount of funding that WFP would need over the period during the COVID crisis and a bit beyond, as we all hope that the end of that crisis is ahead of us, but there will be quite some time before people build back. The challenges were primarily about more people moving into poverty and hunger because of loss of abilities for income earning, and a loss of potential loss of our own funding levels because of the economic challenges our donors faced, and that at a time when needs were rising, and third and finally, our own ability to deliver. What has happened at the present time is the impact of people's food security, as already marginalized populations, that we had seen potential pockets of famine arising. And this is particularly in 4 countries in particular: Burkina Faso, Northeast Nigeria, South Sudan, and Yemen. And these were also, not only were they driven by the COVID crisis, but also by conflict, and in some areas also by the challenges of climate. And so in a sense, those 3 C's, conflict, climate, and COVID, have actually led to areas where there are potential pockets. We haven't seen, and our job is to avert famine happening, but we see it looming on the horizon in some of those countries. Another thing that is really important for us to think about, I've mentioned, the climate impact and the COVID, but that sea of conflict, the conflict dimension of this cannot be understated. If you take the 13 worst food crises around the globe today, 10 of them are in countries which have conflict of one level or another. And so really, we are not going to get to grips with food security as an issue. We're very much dealing with the COVID crisis, which this is a health crisis of our generation and maybe in several generations. This can be overcome and will be overcome by science. However, conflict can only be overcome when we get a peaceful solution, and there will be no end to people's suffering in terms of food security, nutritional security, if we don't deal with conflict.
For more on poverty alleviation around the world, check out our website at globalactioninitiative.com or scan the on-screen QR code. You'll find a range of interactive elements, including polling and quizzes, as well as stories highlighting some of the day-to-day heroes. What is UBI? It's short for Universal Basic Income. Universal because every citizen is entitled to receive it. No labor required, no restrictions on its use. Basic income because it would be enough money to pay for a person's basic living costs. This summer, Spain started providing a UBI-like program nationwide for its poorest citizens. Smaller scale UBI programs are underway in Brazil, Kenya, the United States, India, Germany, South Korea, Finland, and Canada. China guarantees a minimum standard income called dibao, which means subsistence allowance. India has a temporary pandemic relief program for the poor, the Prime Minister's Poor Welfare Scheme. Most nations have social security nets. In the United States, there are 6 government programs for the poor. UBI could help stabilize economies hit by a recession or an unforeseen crisis, like a pandemic. It would be cheaper for governments to implement than existing social entitlements for the poor. The most common objections: free money might discourage people from working. And some argue UBI would be inflationary, so it might not keep people above poverty for long. Inflation would submerge them again. We've assembled a group of global experts to discuss innovative solutions to tackle global poverty. Joining us from Beijing is Chu Chang, a consultant for the International Poverty Reduction Center of China. With us from New Delhi is Deepa Sinha. She's an economist and assistant professor at Ambedkar University and works extensively on social issues. Ken Banks is a social entrepreneur and founder of Kiwanja.net, an application helping social innovators globally. He joins us from Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And from Rio de Janeiro, Marcelo Neri is a former Brazilian Minister of Strategic Affairs and an expert on Brazilian income transfer program Family Grant. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Chu Chang, let me start with you. China set itself the goal of eradicating poverty by 2020, but of course, as we just heard, the pandemic swept across the world. It also affected China. How did that impact China's efforts to lift people out of poverty?
Well, actually, China has been planning for a very long time about poverty reduction. Actually, if you know about the whole story, China started the poverty alleviation ever since the reform and opening up at the end of the 1970s or early in the 1980s. Well, the country has been going through a lot of phases to try different strategies to pull people out of the poverty. And we have tried many methods. And right now, China has already paved out one of its successful road. We call it targeted poverty alleviation, which has been carried out ever since 2012, and it's been working quite well. We have adopted many methodologies like the entire village advancement strategy, or we have the resettlement for a better life, and also we have the local champion company plus the rural cooperative plus the household of the poor family. And all kinds of these strategies are helping the Chinese farmers are getting out of the trap of the deep poverty. And right now we're seeing this is the end of the last year of the tough campaign against poverty in China, according to the government promise. And we've been seeing the progress has been solid. Even though we have the pandemic this year, but I don't think the total achievement will be disrupted by this situation, because the government has already been planned for the impact of the temporary situation like this. In China, the government has prepared for like the minimum living allowance for the poor family who doesn't have any condition to support themselves, or in all kinds of temporary situations like the pandemic. And as well, in China, we have a different situation, very special, is that every farmer, every householder are entitled with one piece of farmland and one piece of residential land. Nobody can take it away. So when pandemic break out in the city and, the less densely populated rural area actually become the paradise, become an escape. People just came back to their rural home and plant food, and they can have enough food by themselves, and the government will give them minimum living allowance, some certain amount of cash, so they can just go through this pandemic well safely.
Marcelo Neri, Brazil was one of the worst hit countries by COVID-19. The economy took a hit because of the lockdowns. People were not able to go to work in places. But the government did introduce a relief program for those affected by the pandemic. What kind of help did people get from the government?
It was quite a big program. It costs around, all measures around 10% of Brazilian GDP. Is one of the largest in comparison with other emerging countries. You include about 1/3 of the population. The problem, it's very important now, but the problem that's not sustainable, so we have, given the fiscal situation, it will last only until the end of the year. So I think it's certainly a generous initiative. I don't know if it's wise in the long run. We will know that in about a year or so. I'm a bit concerned with 2021. I think the 2020 is pretty good in Brazil, in spite of the serious economic situation. About 15 million people lived out of poverty comparing to the pre-pandemic levels. So it was actually a good year, but perhaps too generous. So I tend to think more in terms of a more target approach for now onwards, even for pandemic reasons.
So what are your concerns, Marcelo, about next year? Would you recommend that the government lower the amount of relief that goes to people?
The government is already lowering this amount. The problem is that Brazil is discussing a lot, as other countries, this universal basic income, which I don't think is a good solution in the Brazilian case, given that we have a lot of inequality. So a technology that distributes income from the rich to the poorest does a much better job. We can eradicate poverty at about 1/20 cost if it's perfectly targeted. So Brazil, I don't think, is the country to do something, across the board. We have technology, we have Bolsa Família, which is a conditional cash transfer. It costs, just 0.5% of GDP. So I think we should try to build from that onwards.
Okay, let me go to Ken Banks in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Ken, Marcelo Neri mentioned universal basic income, UBI as it's known. It's not a new idea. It's been around for some time. Here in the United States, some big tech executives are in favor of this. It is already being used, or tested rather, in some countries in Europe. What are your thoughts on using UBI to get people out of poverty?
Yeah, well, personally, I quite like the idea. If you think about humanitarian aid and humanitarian relief, which isn't, of course, the normal kind of modus operandi for most people don't constantly live in crises. But when you think about how people are traditionally helped in relief programs, they are given blankets, they're given bedding, they're given water bottles, they're given food and resources, but they're not given cash to enable them to buy what they think they need the most. And I think this move towards the concept of giving people cash so that they can make their own decisions about how they use that money, I think it's the right way to go. I think we've seen quite a few experiments in the global development sector. There's still much that we need to learn. I think when you look at it from the perspective of the developed world, if we can call it that, the idea or the notion of giving people money, £1,000 or maybe £1,500 a month, giving everybody that money, whether they're working or not working, as a sort of a universal income, is politically very, very sensitive. There are a lot of people in many countries who don't believe that people should be paid to do nothing. I think the reason maybe a lot of governments haven't necessarily deployed these types of programs yet, despite the evidence that they can actually be very effective, is because they're politically very sensitive. And in 2016, about 5 years ago in Switzerland, in a referendum on whether the country should switch to a universal but basic income model, about 80% of people in the referendum actually voted against it. And I think that's interesting because probably in the UK, the number wouldn't be that much different. As a tool for poverty reduction, I think that is what it is. It's not a silver bullet. I think that maybe national programs are mired in controversy and the politics of that. But if you're thinking about applying it perhaps locally or to a targeted group, then there's quite a few examples out there of UBI programs where a small amount of money or a reasonable amount of money given to a targeted community, whether they're homeless people or people living in poverty, can actually have a very, very positive impact. So the evidence, I think, is encouraging, but the political will to implement these programs, I don't think in many places is there yet.
Deepa Sena, as I mentioned, the UBI program is being implemented in some European countries, but let's talk about this program with specific reference to developing countries and affordability. Can developing countries afford a program like this to lift people out of poverty, to give them some kind of social security net?
So I would like to say two things here. One is that UBI program where you're giving universal income is seen to be effective when the cash amount that is being given is of a reasonable amount. And once we start thinking of giving a reasonable amount to everyone who is, even if not universal, who is poor, then that does become quite expensive. Say in a country like India, it would easily cost something like, say, 3 to 4% of the GDP. And I think it also needs to be seen in the overall context of poverty. So it is something that can be used as a social security measure, as a social protection measure in times of crisis. Like in the COVID time, I think it's very useful to give cash to people. But we also need to look at the overall context where people don't have access to basic services. And I think as a priority to fighting poverty, that's what comes first for a country like India, is making sure that people have access to education, to health, to clean drinking water, to sanitation. And these are things that don't get solved on their own by just giving people cash. So I think the way the UBI debate has been going on in India, the cash transfers are looked at as a substitute to everything else that the government does, and in fact doesn't do enough. And that, I think, is a problematic issue because we can't get away from providing these basic services to people. We know that markets fail in providing health, in providing basic primary education, and those need to be in place first. Only then we can think of a UBI. However, there's nothing, it as an additional small amount for certain people like the old people who don't have any pensions, pregnant women, and so on, it's very useful.
Chu Chiang, China, of course, used many strategies to lift people out of poverty. You outlined some of them a moment ago. But did China ever consider using the idea of universal basic income as one of those strategies?
No, we do have similar concept, but it's never something look like UBI. In China, we do provide like minimum living allowance to the poor household, like I just mentioned. But that's a very different concept from UBI. First of all, not everyone can get that. You need to be identified as accurate or targeted poor household. Then you can apply for that basic minimum living allowance. And it goes through a lot of process. You will have the designated government officials to go to your family to check out your living condition, and then your name will be posted in the village square. So everyone in this village will look at your name and they will say, well, this family is really poor because I confirm that, I endorse that. So when nobody have a second opinion about your family's situation, and then your name will be reported up to the village committee and reported to the government of upper level, and then they will set up an archive and a record of your family, and then they will give you the minimum living allowance. But that minimum living allowance cannot be used that freely. For example, they will provide you some basic living subsistence like food and water and electricity. They guarantee you that. But for the extra things like the education, like the sports, necessary supports issues, they will just use the entrusted payment method. For example, if your kids is going to go to school, the government will pay directly to the school about your books, about all the stuff like the dinners and lunch, but they will not give the cash to you. But because we have already went through the wrong way, we used to just pay them everything. They give them the UBI payment. But it turns out to be a disaster. Many poor households cannot use the money responsibly. They get drunk, they will abuse the drugs, or they just gamble it away. So not everyone will commit to this problem, but we see a proper amount of it. So we change our way to the current practice, and it looks fine now.
Deepa Sinha, we've been gathering questions from around the world from people who are struggling to make ends meet. We have one here from Willis Odiambo, who runs a small pharmacy in one of the poorest, most vulnerable parts of the city of Nairobi in Kenya. His customers are by and large destitute. Let's listen.
What role should the government play in providing healthcare, housing, and social services for poor communities?
So, Deepa, that's a question that we hear very often. What role should government play? I mean, if you look at the United States here, there are people who believe that government should play no role whatsoever in providing those kinds of services like healthcare, housing, and social services. But what is the answer to that question?
Well, I in fact believe that the government has a very strong role to play in provision of these basic services. There are very strong economic arguments in favor of the government playing a role because markets fail, like I was saying, in the context of education and health. And in a country like India, where there is so much inequality geographically, socially, and economically, if it is all left to the market, then it will only enhance the inequities that are there. And all data also shows that healthcare, for example, is one thing in which the US is actually not doing very well. Even if you compare outcomes like infant mortality and life expectancy in the US vis-a-vis European countries, which are doing much better, where the government plays a big role in providing healthcare. So I think these are things, and the other countries that are represented on this panel, both China and Brazil, from what I know about them, along with their anti-poverty programs, do also have very strong public programs in provision of these basic services, particularly education and health. And that is what has contributed to their reduction in poverty. So I think it's really crucial.
Okay, we are going to pause right now and listen to Tijani Muhammad Bande. He is president of the 74th United Nations General Assembly. Here's what he had to say about China's efforts on fighting poverty.
The focus on fighting poverty is important. A country of 1 billion people pulling together to get people out of poverty is a major contribution. This is, you see, it's really important. And also of agricultural modernization. The whole question, these are important.
Online sales have been booming in China for the past decade. The market has now surpassed the combined sales in Europe and the United States. But what if we told you internet commerce also plays a big role in the country's poverty reduction efforts? That's right, more than 100,000 poverty alleviation products have entered the market, appealing to the largest online retail population of the world.
我们龙德道收现在目前主要是做微视自媒体，然后主要做农产品这方面，在全国范围内就是寻找优质的农产品，然后我们会和贫困户合作，然后就是教他怎么用微视短视频直播卖货。点开这个第一次的话，我们会 就是通过我们的平台，我们现有的平台去让他尝试一下直播。咱们打开它，然后这边有个加号，咱们现在点这个拍摄，然后开直播，开始直播。好，开始了。
那是周日线4周项。
教会他们怎么使用短视频平台，他们自己去在这个短视频平台上去怎么直播，用同样的果子能创造更大的价值，能赚取更多的收益，也是另一种那个扶贫方式吧。
有什么哪一块最值得推广的？
西乡猕猴桃，这吃特别到这段时间吃，就是特别甜，山豆自带的一劲儿，所以说甜度还是好。
你把这个切开，让大家看一下果汁。你看这个果肉相当那个啥脆溜新鲜。
装满了。这2年的短视频带货是越来越火了，而且流量比较大。对农户操作这一块来说也比较简单，通过一部手机就可以完成全部的操作。用户可以直观的看到咱们猕猴桃的生长环境。对于农户来讲，这也是一种新型的销售方式，而且现在也越来越多的用户喜欢上这种购物方式。
Okay, let's get back to our panel right now. Chu Chiang, we saw an example there of how technology is being used to help lift people out of poverty. How did China use technology to eradicate poverty?
Well, about the technology China used to solve the poverty alleviation problem, I can give you one word: the network, a physical network and a virtual network. About the physical network is the transportation network, the roads. In the very early stage of Chinese poverty alleviation, the government tried to find out why those people live in a mountainous area or remote area are poor. They're smart, they're inspired, they're hardworking for their whole life, and they have really good product like green food, like cage-free chicken and everything. But why they're poor? And then we find out the farmers live so far away from the market. Lots of them have to travel like dozens of miles to the nearest free market to sell their product to get the cash back. This something need to be changed. So the government of China started probably the largest campaign of the road building in human history. We built like thousands and tens of thousands of miles of the transportation network to reach out to the poor family and live in a remote area so they can get access to the market. It turns out to be very effective of the poverty alleviation. But later in the new century, 21st century, we have the internet platform, we have the e-commerce platform like Alibaba, Tencent. And suddenly we find out a virtual network can also be a good way to brand the farmers and products out. And those farmers sometimes are really talented. They immediately jump in front of the camera, they become an actor or actress, started to show their product to all the consumers all over the country, and they can sing and they can dance and they can just brand their products out. Just take a look at the Double 11 days of China, the big sales day in China. A lot of farmers in China, especially the ones live in a remote area, they promote their product in front of the video streaming platform and make the millions and billions of worth of Chinese yuan sales of the farming products. It's a big win of the poverty reduction, and also it's a big win for the farmers themselves.
Marcelo Neri, you were talking to us a moment ago about the use of technology in distributing these payments and grants. You've had extensive experience in these income transfer programs, but are they open to abuse?
No, definitely. There are a lot of problems, but I think, these conditional cash transfers like Bolsa Familia and, they are all over Latin America and other regions are just the beginning of a fight, of a poverty fight. You have like a platform, where people are, their names, what they do, etc. So if you mix that with technology, for instance, in Brazil, we have, all the voting, you have biometric that can be checked from a distance, even during the pandemic. So I think we have a lot of possibilities to improve our poverty alleviation efforts, as in the case of China. But so I think it's really just the beginning. I think, but at the same time, I think we shouldn't forget simpler technologies like, sanitation, something that was invented in the 19th century, as a public infrastructure. Or, for instance, during the pandemic, we see the children in Brazil, the students, are only studying 2 hours a day, basically because, and on average, because a lot of people don't have technology, don't have a internet access. So I think we have to go for the fancy stuff, but at the same time, I think we shouldn't forget about the more basic, basic services. So it's always a combination, a middle path of, high technology, market-oriented things, but also we shouldn't forget the basic services, the basic needs. So it's kind of a combination of these two possibilities.
Ken Banks, I was looking here at a quotation from Susan Davis. She's a professor at New York University. She's a consultant on social entrepreneurship. And she wrote that, and I'm quoting here, the prospect of billions rising up from poverty with nothing more than gadgets is indeed a fanciful notion. What do you make of a statement like that?
Well, I'd have to agree. I think the notion that everybody can be a successful entrepreneur and everybody wants to be a successful entrepreneur, and that technology and new and emerging technology is going to drive this growth, I think it is a bit of a dream. It will certainly drive a lot of it. I think technology is presenting a lot of opportunities for people. But let's not forget that entrepreneurs have existed for as long as anyone can remember, been around for centuries. People have seen opportunities and people have, in many cases, grasped them. I think there's no lack of entrepreneurial flair and there's no lack of entrepreneurial ability in many emerging markets where there are people who need to be or want to pull themselves out of poverty. I think the notion that people are waiting for the international community to roll in with the latest shiny technologies, say, and just give them handouts, in many cases not true. There are plenty of very, very able, willing and enthusiastic individuals in developing countries who are more than capable of helping themselves out of poverty if they're given the opportunities. And many people, in fact, use the tools and services that become available in very entrepreneurial ways. So once WhatsApp started to become prevalent in communities where there were smartphones and internet access, people figured out for themselves ways of exchanging prices for their cows, sending pictures of their produce. It wasn't a global development effort. It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't a university putting this thing together and taking it to communities at all. So I think if the environment is right, and in some cases that is the right technology, then people are more than capable of lifting themselves out of poverty. But that's certainly not everybody. I think the idea that everyone, everywhere, can create a business and solve a big problem, I don't think plays out in reality at all. So I very much agree with that quote.
Deepa Sen, I want to talk about food and people's right to food. You've done a great deal of work on food programs, people's right to food. Take a country like India, which has a very big agricultural sector. How is technology being used in a country like India, or in fact in other developing countries, to improve the production and distribution of food?
So like in everything else, technology can only be an additional tool in improving the production of food as well as distribution. And it has to be seen in the wider social context. So while we do have, for instance, hybrid seeds, which came with the Green Revolution, did play a big role in making India food secure in the production of cereals. These days, there is a lot of talk about using genetically modified seeds and so on. But all of these also raise questions about who has the control over the seeds, how much of the profits really do go to the farmers, what does it mean to the consumers and so on, which are yet to be resolved. And similarly, the government has a number of programs where technology through smartphones and so on is used to inform farmers about prices, about what crops they should be sowing. While these are useful, technology can be very powerful, particularly in the dissemination of information. Once again, it's not enough. It needs to be seen in the bigger context. As far as distribution goes, there was a mention of the UID, the Universal ID program that India has called Aadhaar, which has been used to try and reduce the leakages in the distribution programs. So we have a huge public distribution system which gives subsidized food grains to the poor, and it was alleged to be very leaky, the system, that the grains did not really reach the poor. So now in a large part of the country, it has been made mandatory that people have to match their biometrics to get their grain entitlements. Even in that case, it has been seen that there are as many problems as the benefits that it brings. So like we've been seeing that there are connectivity issues in matching the fingerprints. Not everybody's fingerprints match is also something we've discovered, and that certain kinds of fraud still continues. So even if the fingerprint matches, for example, the local dealer gives only 4 kilos in place of 5 kilos, and that is something the technology can't catch. So I think technology overall is a tool which can be used positively, but the context in which it is being applied is also very important. And the local power dynamics finally end up coming into place. So empowering people along with providing them technology becomes very important.
Marcelo Nero, we have another question here. This is from Shireen Ajina. She lives in Kenya. She works sewing clothes, which she sells online. She has a question for you. Let's listen.
How can we find jobs for the women if they have to watch for their children?
That's an important question, the role of women in the workplace. And I'm wondering to what extent we are seeing progress with getting women to the workplace. It also raises questions because traditionally women have been at home looking after children. Does it also mean that daycare now becomes a priority for many governments around the world?
First thing, like programs like conditional cash transfers use the role of women, of mothers in particular, their altruism to make sure that the resources go to the family as a whole. So I see this is quite a progress. Second point, I think, for example, in the pandemic, we see a big, share of the burden on the female's shoulder. Because of exactly this role, the labor market position, and there is mostly sacrifice. So we should try to think in ways to share more this burden, and this is of course a cultural issue. In the Western world, at least, which I know better, I think women have, since they are having much more progress in terms of education than males. I think the future is on their hands. We just need to do the cultural adaptation for that. So I think it's different, for example, for example, blacks in Brazil. They are not well positioned in terms of education. So you need to do first a revolution in school, and then revolution at homes, and then in the labor market. The women's, I think they have done already 2 or 3 stages of this revolution. We just need to have a more reasonable type of arrangement within families, within society. But I'm really positive about women's role. I think it's changing, and I think with respect to race, I think this is starting to change in Brazil, especially in this year. But I think this is a much longer road.
You can learn more about Shireen Ajina and Willis Odhiambo's stories in our documentary, Rise Up, at the top of the hour.
A global initiative to end poverty threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic.
लॉकडाउन के बाद तो इतनी परेशानी आई है ना कि सच बताएं तो 2-2 दिन समझ लो घर में खाना ही नहीं बना जब ये स्कूल का खाना बंद हो गया ना.
Finding creative solutions to weather the storm.
I just got a call from a customer who saw my post and is coming to pick the medicine right away.
and turning to illicit means of income out of desperation.
Porque yo siembro coca porque es rentable, porque te da un poquito más economía, porque para mantener a mis hijos.
Rise Up, Poverty Alleviation.
Right now, we're going to listen to Abdullah Al-Walimi. He is the Saudi ambassador to the United Nations. I asked him what countries can do to eradicate poverty.
Two things I think the world can do. Number one, heed the call of the Secretary General for a worldwide ceasefire. Saudi Arabia has already declared its acceptance of this call by the Secretary General. Other parties in regional conflicts have not, whether it is in Syria or in Yemen or in Libya or otherwise. So it's obvious that the continuation of conflict can only aggravate the situation of hunger and deprivation in the region. And secondly, intensify efforts to fight the coronavirus and to help the less capable countries in capacity building and in their development of programs to fight the coronavirus. And Saudi Arabia has been a leader in that battle, not only through its own resources, but also by mobilizing the resources of the G20 to do the same.
The fight against poverty doesn't have to be carried out by governments and international organizations alone. Everyday people like you and me can help create a more fair society, and that's become easier with technology. Here's one example of people joining forces to reduce inequality.
Conrad Shaw has spent much of his adult life thinking about and advocating for a universal basic income, or UBI, programs that give every citizen a fixed amount of money on a regular basis. He's now planning on launching an app that would create a form of UBI at a grassroots level. It's called Commingle.
Commingle is essentially taking what the government should be doing and making it private.
On the app, each Commingle member contributes 7% of their income on a weekly basis. That money is then put into a pot that is evenly distributed to everyone on the app. Shaw says if every American participated, roughly 65% of them would either break even or come out ahead.
10 million Americans would be lifted above the poverty line. 24 million would still stay under the poverty line. That's because this is a partial UBI. It's only 7%.
He's now working on signing up 100 initial members with a variety of incomes. It could provide harder to sell to wealthier people.
What I would say to them is it's by far the most effective way you could give back. It's more effective than what we would do with tax dollars. It's more effective than what you would give to the Red Cross or whatever by a lot of metrics.
Last night, my friend's sleeping in the park. It's cold out here. I'm not sleeping in no park.
Shaw seeks to give a personal account of UBI in action. He's created a documentary series called Bootstraps that followed 22 people who received $1,000 a month for 2.5 years, no questions asked. The speed at which lives were changed surprised him.
It almost felt like taking people off a leash. There's all these plans people have in their minds that think that they're going to get to as soon as they can get above water, as soon as they have a little feeling of security. You know, all these things people wanted to do, it was like weeks into it where they're like already doing it.
Okay, let's get back to our panel right now. And Ken Banks, I'm going to start with you for this part of the program. We just saw the idea of people sharing their income to help reduce inequality. Is that really workable? Is it a practical solution?
Well, I think the idea of many people contributing a relatively small amount of money is how charity has worked since the beginning of time. So to digitize that in an app, bring it all into one place, and then to sell the concept and the idea and sell the research and the rationale behind what you're doing certainly makes sense. I think it is a shame, perhaps, that governments are not taking on the responsibility to look after their own citizens. This came up earlier in the conversation. The fact that the private sector has to step up to do this is slightly worrying, and I think that if the private sector starts to own efforts to reduce poverty, then we end up in a very different place where companies can choose to turn things on and off based on a business model or based on a plan. But the idea that anybody anywhere now can use the reach of social media to pull communities together, to pull together people with like-minded concerns and interests. The fact that people can now use mobile apps and internet sites to run these kinds of programs, who previously would never have really been able to do this at the scale that we can now do it, is opening up incredible opportunities, not just for people in the US to solve US problems, but if you think about, for example, the African continent, there are several hundred now innovation hubs across the African continent, full of very able local programmers, very able local business people who better understand the issues that the people in those countries are facing. And they now have the tools at their disposal to start to build their own local solutions to those local problems. And that's the bit that really excites me the most.
Chu Chiang, President Xi Jinping of China has set 2020 as the goal to eradicate poverty, and so far the program has been working very well. But I'm wondering, to what extent has the success of this program depended on people, ordinary people in villages and towns throughout China complying with what the government wanted, with being part of this, of cooperating, working together to get this program done?
Well, yes. Actually, we find out through like 40 more years of the poverty alleviation job, we find out many things of this campaign. Well, I myself honorably and humbly used to be part of this campaign in helping poor people traveling around all these poor areas. And we do find out something we need to work on is that eventually, no matter what you just mentioned about microloans, or you mentioned about the donations, you mentioned about the UBIs, and everything has been tried out in China like for 40 years. And in President Xi Jinping's period of time, we find out the secret should be the targeted poverty alleviation. And the secret behind this secret is actually help the people who can help themselves. No matter you give them money or give them resources or give them whatever you can give them, eventually the one who can help themselves is the one who are inspired and the one who with the capability. So you really need to find out the one who dare to help themselves, the one who are willing to change their life. You know, we have a saying here in China, the poor people, they don't need a handout, they need a hands up. A lot of people are saying that China is going to eradicate the poverty right now. Well, that's probably some misunderstanding. We're just going to eradicate extreme poverty in China. But the natural poverty or comparative poverty still we're going to stay with us for a very long time. So that's the future direction we're going to move towards.
Deepa Sinha, according to United Nations figures, India lifted 270 million people out of poverty between 2006 and 2017. But of course, in the past year, we've had the pandemic, and the pandemic is threatening those gains. It's jeopardizing those gains. How does the government act now to prevent people sliding back into poverty?
So like you said, the pandemic has of course changed things quite a bit. But I think in our response to the pandemic, which the government has already been doing a bit of and can do much more, is to look at what is it that happened between 2006 and 17 that helped this reduction in poverty. And some, along with, of course, this being largely a period where there was high economic growth as well, there were certain public programs which helped the poor directly. One of the most successful was what is called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, where every household is provided at least 100 days of employment at minimum wages on demand. So any rural household can go up to their local government and say, we can't find any work, so provide us work. And they have to be given that work within 15 days. This not only helped in creating employment locally, putting wages into people's hands, but also the way the program was designed, the work that people did was to create local assets. So we saw roads being built, say, to connect the village to the main market road, village wells being cleaned and repaired, local small irrigation projects being taken up. All of these also created a multiplier effect, and the overall productivity went up. So expanding something like the employment guarantee program to urban areas as well, and during this immediate period of the pandemic, expanding it from 100 days to maybe more would be something that we should look at. So overall, it would still be a focus on employment and universal basic services, including food, health, and education, which helped us in the past and which is something that is required now in the context of the pandemic as well.
Marcelo Neri, I have another quotation here, and this one is about the impact of the pandemic. This was written by Homi Karas, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution right here in Washington, D.C., and he wrote recently, "There is no technological or financial reason to accept the reversals in global poverty being wrought by COVID-19. The damage is due to a lack of political will and international leadership on the issue." You agree with that?
I agree completely. I know him, and I think this was true about 50 years ago, and it's even more true now. The world has resources more than enough to end at least extreme poverty, and but we have to choose the right technology. You know, I think this is, if we choose a blunt instrument, it will cost much more. You're going to have adverse effects on the economy. So, you know, we have seen here in Brazil, even, you know, Brazil is like the farm of the world in terms of food production. Like, you know, China is the factory of the world, and or India is the office of the world. Brazil is the farm, and we have, you know, if we see food security, food insecurity has grown. In, you know, we have a worse situation in 2018, the latest data, than we had 2003. Because we didn't, you know, take the right decisions when we had a big recession. We didn't, you know, the recession is still today with the poorest people. So I think it's, you know, the world has a lot of resources. If we do just the basic, the obvious thing, you know, the end of the poverty, at least income poverty, which is just the beginning, is at our reach, you know, everywhere. And I think it's very good to be in a program with someone from India and from China, because we are talking about 40% of the world population, something like that. So we are really talking about attacking at the scale of the problem worldwide.
Okay, I have one final question, and this is going to be addressed to all of you, and I'd be really grateful if you could keep it brief. And these are for your individual expectations on poverty alleviation in 2021. Deepa Sinha, let me start with you first.
Like I said, recognizing the context of COVID and strengthening the various poverty alleviation programs that we have across the world. We know there are no magic bullets. We need to do UBI, we need to do basic services, we need to create employment.
Well, I think 2021 is still going to be a tough year, and more people still need help. Unite, we win, and separate, we're going to lose. So we need the leadership, we will need the inspiration, and I think if we're determined, we can win.
I agree. I think 2021 is going to be difficult, but I think we have the tools. We know how to do this. And I think a combination of political will and social uprising, if that's the right word, I think we can do it.
I agree with my colleagues. You know, leadership, inspiration is key, you know, to use, you know, all we know, social services, you know, cash transfers, target cash transfers, we can do that. I think it's, I'm very worried about Brazil in 2021, but I think, you know, it's in our reach. We can change that.
Thanks for your thoughts and insights. And on that note, let's take a look at expectations for 2021 around the world. While governments and global organizations have put great efforts into eradicating poverty, on the ground, there is still work to be done.
在2020年，我们实现了全面脱贫这一伟大的目标。那么在2021年，我们将继续推进乡村振兴。我也非常乐意投身到这一伟大的事业当中，帮助更多的农村人口走向致富的道路，过上幸福的生活。
In Africa, access to healthcare is still a priority.
My hope is to open an hospital in Kibera to serve the people, the community, especially in the Kibera, because we are in the slums, so that they can be having a better life and they proceed with their lives.
Achieving gender equality in India.
दुनिया की महिलाओं के लिए बेहतर जगह बनाने के लिए सरकार हमारे लिए कर सकती है कि जैसे बच्चों का जो स्कूल है वो आसपास होना चाहिए ताकि महिलाएं अगर नौकरी पे जा रही हैं तो उन्हें किसी चीज़ का डर न रहे.
Looking for better crops in South America.
En el futuro cercano me gustaría llevar cursos de capacitación agrícola para incorporar la tecnología a la agricultura y así mejorar los estándares de calidad que exige el mercado internacional.
All in hopes of building a better future. That's all the time we have. We'd like to thank our experts for participating in this year's Global Action Initiative, where we aim to commit, engage, and empower. This program is coming to an end, but our special coverage continues. Up next is the second part of Rise Up, our documentary exploring poverty alleviation around the world.